Welcome. We find ourselves again in the quiet hours, a space we've carved out from the relentless pace of the modern world. Tonight we journey back in time, not to the grand battlefields or the gilded thrones of kings, but to a place far more intimate, more personal, the sickbed of the medieval world. We are going to explore the fascinating and often frightening landscape of medieval medicine, a world where science and superstition, faith and folklore were inextricably intertwined. We will uncover how a physician, a village herbalist, or a monastery infirmer would have understood the human body, the causes of illness, and the delicate art of healing. It was a system built not on microscopes and laboratories, but on the ancient wisdom of the four humors, the potent magic of herbs, and the ever-present hand of God. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. For you, it's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not with a patient, but with an idea so powerful, so pervasive that it would dominate medical thinking for over 2,000 years, shaping every diagnosis, every treatment, every aspect of life and death. This was the theory of the four humors. To us, it sounds like something from a fantasy novel, a quaint and archaic belief. But to the medieval mind, it was the fundamental truth of human existence, the very blueprint of the body and soul. The theory wasn't a medieval invention. It was a legacy, a hand-me-down from the great thinkers of classical antiquity, from Hippocrates and, most importantly, from Galen of Pergamon, a Roman physician whose writings were treated with the same reverence as religious scripture. Galen's work, preserved and translated by Islamic scholars, was reintroduced to Europe in the High Middle Ages, and it formed the unshakable foundation upon which the entire edifice of medieval medicine was built. The concept was, at its heart, an elegant one. It proposed that the human body was a microcosm, a miniature reflection of the great macrocosm of the universe. Just as the world was composed of four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, the body was composed of four corresponding fluids or humors. These were not just vague life forces. They were believed to be real, tangible substances coursing through the veins and tissues. The first was blood, hot and moist, like the element of air. The second was phlegm, cold and moist like water. The third was yellow bile, hot and dry like fire. And the fourth was black bile, cold and dry like the earth itself. Each humor was produced by a specific organ: blood from the liver, phlegm from the brain and lungs, yellow bile from the gallbladder, and black bile from the spleen. A person's health, their vitality, their very personality, was determined by the delicate balance of these four fluids. When all four humors were in perfect equilibrium, a state known as eucrasia, the individual was healthy, strong, and in harmony with themselves and the world. But this balance was fragile, a delicate dance that could be disrupted by 1,000 different factors: diet, weather, age, emotional state. Even the alignment of the stars could cause one or more humors to increase or decrease, to become corrupted or peccant. This imbalance, this dyscrasia, was the universal cause of all disease. Illness was not seen as an invasion by an external agent, like a virus or bacteria, but as an internal disharmony, a body at war with itself. This humoral theory also gave birth to the concept of temperaments, which would echo through centuries of art, literature, and psychology. It was believed that every person was born with a natural predisposition towards an abundance of one particular humor. This didn't mean they were ill, but that it defined their fundamental character. A person with a predominance of blood was sanguine. They were cheerful, optimistic, and sociable, their cheeks rosy, their disposition as warm and pleasant as a spring day. Someone with an excess of phlegm was phlegmatic. They were calm, patient, and unemotional, perhaps a bit sluggish. There, nature as tranquil and slow-moving as a deep river. An individual dominated by yellow bile was choleric. They were ambitious, fiery, and quick to anger, their energy as intense and volatile as a summer fire. And finally, a person with too much black bile was melancholic. They were thoughtful, introverted, and prone to sadness, their mood as somber and contemplative as the earth in late autumn. This framework of temperaments was a powerful tool for the medieval physician. When a patient came before them, the doctor was not just looking at symptoms. They were reading a person's entire being. They would assess the patient's natural temperament. Their age, youth was hot and moist, old age cold and dry. The season, summer was hot and dry, winter cold and moist, and their lifestyle. A choleric man suffering from a fever in the height of summer was a straightforward case, an excess of his natural humor, yellow bile, exacerbated by the season. The diagnosis was an excess of heat and dryness. The treatment, therefore, was logical: to cool and moisten the body, to restore the lost equilibrium. To determine the specific nature of the humoral imbalance, the physician relied on a detailed sensory examination. They were masters of observation, their senses honed to detect the subtle signs of internal chaos. The most important diagnostic tool was the uroscopy wheel, a chart that detailed up to 20 different colors, densities, and even taste of urine. A flask of the patient's urine held up to the light was a window into the body. Was the urine pale and thin? A sign of excess phlegm, of cold and moisture. Was it frothy and reddish? An indication of too much blood, of heat and moisture. Was it a dark, almost black color with a foul odor? This pointed to a dangerous corruption of black bile, a melancholic crisis that could be fatal. The physician would also meticulously examine the patient's stool, their sweat, their breathing, and, most critically, their pulse. They identified dozens of different types of pulse, each corresponding to a specific internal state, described with evocative names like the gazelle's leap or the ant's crawl. Imagine a patient, let's call him Thomas, a stonemason, who presents to a physician in the city of Paris in the year 1250. Thomas is feverish, his skin is flushed, he has a pounding headache, and a hacking cough that produces thick, yellowish sputum. He is naturally a man of sanguine temperament, usually cheerful and robust. The physician observes his flushed face, feels the heat of his skin, and takes his pulse, noting its strength and rapidity. He examines a flask of Thomas's urine, observing its dark, reddish hue. The diagnosis is clear. Thomas, a sanguine man, naturally has a predominance of hot and moist blood. He has likely caught a chill while working, disrupting his natural balance. His body is now producing an excess of corrupted blood, leading to a dangerous surplus of heat. The yellow sputum indicates that the heat is cooking the phlegm in his lungs. The goal of treatment is to rid the body of this surplus of hot, corrupt blood and to cool the patient down. The physician will not prescribe a chemical to kill a pathogen. He will prescribe a regimen to restore balance. This is where the core treatments of medieval medicine, which we will explore in our next chapter, come into play. Bloodletting to physically remove the excess humor. A diet of cooling and moistening foods, such as barley water, cucumbers, and fish. Herbal remedies with cooling properties, like willow bark or violet. Every aspect of the treatment flows directly and logically from the initial humoral diagnosis. It was a complete and self-contained system of thought. While it may seem utterly alien to us, it provided a rational, ordered way to understand the terrifying randomness of disease. It gave both patient and physician a map, a shared language, and a clear path forward, turning the chaos of suffering into a problem that could, with wisdom and care, be solved. This profound belief in the four humors was the very heart of medieval medicine, the first and most important step in the long and arduous journey from sickness back to health. We left our stonemason, Thomas, in the care of a Parisian physician, his body overwhelmed by a fever, a diagnosis of excessive, corrupted blood having been declared. The path forward, dictated by 2 millennia of medical doctrine, was not one of gentle persuasion. It was a path of active, aggressive intervention. The physician's goal was simple and direct. The corrupt humor that poisoned Thomas's system must be removed. The body, in its wisdom, was already trying to do this, attempting to cook the excess humors into sputum and sweat. But it was failing. It required help. The physician was not merely a passive observer, but an active gardener of the human body, and the garden was overgrown with a toxic weed. It was time to pull it out by the roots. This was the doctrine of evacuation, a core tenet of medieval healing that encompassed 2 of its most infamous and dramatic practices, bloodletting and purging. To our modern sensibilities, these are procedures of almost barbaric crudity, a testament to the ignorance of the past. But to the medieval world, they were the height of medical sophistication, a logical, necessary, and often life-saving response to the internal chaos of disease. They were not acts of random violence, but precise and calculated maneuvers in the delicate war to restore humoral balance. The primary and most celebrated of these techniques was phlebotomy, or venesection, the practice we know as bloodletting. For the university-trained physician, the lancet was as much a symbol of his profession as the uroscopy flask. It was a declaration of his power to directly manipulate the very substance of life. Bloodletting was not a last resort. It was often the first. It was used for everything from fevers and plagues to headaches, joint pain, and even emotional distress. The underlying principle was straightforward. If the body contained too much blood, or if the blood itself had become corrupt, then the surplus must be drained away. This would reduce the overall volume, ease the pressure on the organs, and allow the body to generate new, healthy blood in its place. It was seen as a way of assisting nature, of opening a sluice gate to relieve a dangerous flood. The amount of blood to be let could be staggering, often until the patient, already weakened by illness, fainted from the loss. This syncope was not seen as a dangerous side effect, but was often interpreted as the very moment of crisis, the point at which the body shocked by the intervention, finally expelled the morbid humor and began its turn towards healing. The act of bloodletting was surrounded by a complex web of rules and rituals that elevated it from simple butchery to a high medical art. The physician would never just make an incision at random. He would consult a zodiac man, a diagram found in countless medical manuscripts that linked parts of the body to the 12 astrological signs. This celestial influence was considered profoundly important, bleeding a certain part of the body. When the corresponding sign of the zodiac was ruling, was believed to be exceptionally dangerous, as the star's power would be too concentrated in that area. Therefore, a physician had to be something of an astrologer, calculating the precise and most auspicious time for the procedure, considering the phase of the moon, the position of the planets, and the time of day. This added a layer of cosmic significance to the act, reassuring the patient that their treatment was in harmony with the very workings of the universe. Once the time was deemed right, the location of the incision was chosen with equal care. Medical texts contained detailed charts of the venous system, showing specific veins that were believed to be connected to different organs and humors. If a patient suffered from a liver ailment, the organ responsible for producing blood, a vein on the right arm, such as the basilica vein, would be chosen. For ailments of the head or brain, the cephalic vein on the outer arm was the preferred site. For problems of the lower body, like kidney stones or menstrual irregularities, the saphenous vein near the ankle was opened. The physician or more, commonly a barber-surgeon acting on his instructions, would prepare his tools. These might include a fleam, a short, sharp blade set at a right angle to a handle, which was placed over the vein and tapped with a small wooden stick called a fleam stick. To make the cut, more common was the lancet, a simple, double-edged blade, often exquisitely crafted with an ivory or silver handle. Imagine Thomas, his arm extended, gripping a small wooden staff to make the vein swell and stand proud. The barber-surgeon, his sleeves rolled up, would tie a linen tourniquet above the elbow. He would palpate the vein, finding the perfect spot. Then, with a swift, practiced movement, the lancet would pierce the skin and the vein wall. The blood, dark and thick with fever, would well up and begin to stream into a waiting bowl. The bowl itself was often marked with graduated lines, so the practitioner could measure the exact quantity being removed. The patient would be watched closely for signs of faintness. The smell of blood, coppery and thick, would fill the small, often poorly lit room. The procedure was terrifying and painful, yet it was also a moment of profound hope. The patient could literally see the disease leaving their body, the bad blood pooling in the bowl. It was tangible, visible proof that something was being done. Yet, venesection was not the only method of drawing blood. For more localized complaints or for patients deemed too frail for the lancet, there was a gentler, though no less strange, alternative: leeches. The medicinal leech, Hirudo medicinalis, was an essential part of the medieval medical toolkit. They were farmed in special ponds or gathered from the wild by leech collectors, who would wade into marshes and allow the creatures to attach to their own legs. Leeches were nature's own phlebotomists. They were used for ailments where drawing blood from a large vein was impractical or considered dangerous. For a throbbing headache, leeches might be applied directly to the temples. For an inflamed eye, they would be placed nearby. For hemorrhoids, they were applied directly to the source of the discomfort. The physician would bring the leeches in a small pot or jar. To encourage them to bite, the skin might be pricked with a needle to draw a drop of blood, or smeared with milk and sugar. Once the leech attached, its saliva would release a powerful cocktail of substances, including an anesthetic to dull the pain and an anticoagulant, hirudin, to ensure the blood flowed freely. A single leech could consume several times its own body weight in blood, and after it detached, the wound would continue to ooze, maximizing the therapeutic effect. A third method, known as cupping or scarification, aimed to draw bad humors from the surface of the body. This involved placing a heated glass or horn cup over the skin. As the air inside the cup cooled, it created a vacuum, sucking the skin up into the vessel. This was known as dry cupping, and it was believed to draw the humors towards the surface. For a more aggressive treatment, this would be followed by wet cupping. The cup would be removed, and the raised area of skin would be rapidly scored with a special tool called a scarificator, a spring-loaded device with multiple small blades that made numerous shallow cuts at once. The heated cup was then reapplied, and the suction would draw a significant amount of blood and fluid from the shallow wounds. This was thought to be particularly effective for muscular pain, boils, and skin lesions, physically pulling the corrupt matter out through the skin. While blood was the most potent humor to manipulate, it was not the only one that could be evacuated. The physician's goal was to rebalance all four humors, and to do so, they needed to utilize all of the body's exits. This led to the widespread use of purging, a series of treatments designed to violently empty the digestive tract. If a patient was suffering from an excess of phlegm, cold and moist, or yellow bile, hot and dry, the physician might prescribe an emetic to induce vomiting. This was seen as the most direct way to cleanse the upper body, especially the stomach and chest. Potent concoctions of herbs like hellebore, mustard, or squill would be mixed with wine or honey and administered to the patient. The result was a brutal, gut-wrenching experience, but one that was believed to be profoundly cleansing, expelling the offending humor in a torrent. For imbalances of the lower body, particularly an excess of the dreaded black bile, the humor of melancholy and death, the physician would turn to laxatives and enemas. Laxative purges were common, using substances ranging from the relatively mild, like prunes and figs, to the dangerously powerful, like scammony or colocynth, which could cause cramping and dehydration. The most direct method of cleansing the lower bowel, however, was the clyster or enema. This involved introducing large quantities of fluid into the colon using a clyster syringe, a fearsome-looking instrument consisting of a long metal tube attached to a plunger or a bladder bag. The concoctions used were complex and varied, a veritable soup of ingredients designed to wash out the corrupted humors. A typical recipe might include water or broth mixed with salt, honey, oils, and a variety of herbs like mallow, pellitory, and chamomile. The application was undignified and uncomfortable, but it was a standard and essential procedure for a huge range of illnesses, from constipation and colic to the fevers of plague. Let us return to Thomas. Following his bloodletting, the physician, seeing that his cough still produced thick, colored phlegm, might well prescribe an emetic to clear his lungs. He would be given a bitter drink, and soon his body would be racked with violent heaves. After this ordeal, to ensure a full cleansing, he might be subjected to a clyster to purge any remaining ill humors from his bowels. Thomas would be left utterly drained, weak, and empty. He would have endured bleeding, vomiting, and purging in a matter of days, or even hours. From our perspective, it's a miracle he would have survived the treatment, let alone the disease. But in the medieval mind, this emptiness was the point. The body was now a clean slate. The battlefield had been cleared. The corrupting enemy within had been flushed out through every available exit. He was now in a fragile, weakened state, but a state of purity. The humoral storm had passed. Now, and only now, could the true healing begin. The next stage of his care would be one of rebuilding, of nourishing the body back to health and gently encouraging the production of new, balanced humors. The violent interventions of the lancet and the purge would give way to a gentler, more subtle, but no less important form of medicine, the healing power of food, and the divine wisdom hidden within the herbs of the field and garden. Having weathered the violent tempest of bleeding and purging, the patient was left in a state of profound vulnerability. The body, scoured clean of its offending humors, was like a newly tilled field, empty and waiting. The aggressive evacuation was merely the first phase of treatment. Now came the second, a phase of nurturing, rebuilding, and gentle persuasion. This was the domain of the herbalist, the apothecary, and the wise woman. It was a world steeped in the scent of drying leaves, boiling roots, and crushed petals. This was the green dominion of herbal medicine, the belief that for every ailment visited upon humanity, God, in his infinite mercy, had provided a cure, a remedy that grew from the earth itself. The monastery garden, the apothecary's shop, and the wild forest were not just sources of food or seasoning. They were a divine pharmacy, a living library of cures waiting to be read by those with the wisdom to understand its language. This understanding was built upon the same humoral principles as the rest of medieval medicine, but it was also interwoven with a rich tapestry of folklore, Christian symbolism, and an intriguing concept known as the doctrine of signatures. The foundation of medieval pharmacology was like diagnosis, built firmly on Galen's humoral theory. Every plant, every herb, every natural substance was believed to possess its own specific qualities of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness, graded on a scale of 1 to 4. The goal of the herbalist was to counteract the patient's humoral imbalance with a plant of the opposite properties. For our stonemason Thomas, left weakened and cool after his fever broke and the hot blood was let, the physician would prescribe remedies that were warming and nourishing. A fever caused by an excess of phlegm, cold and moist, however, would be treated with herbs that were hot and dry, such as mustard, ginger, or cloves, to dry up the phlegm and warm the body. A melancholic patient, suffering from an excess of cold and dry black bile, might be given moistening and warming herbs like borage or balm to lift the spirits. This system was one of intricate balance, a delicate dance of opposites. The apothecary's shelves were a testament to this philosophy, jars filled with dried leaves, powders, and seeds, each labeled not just with its name, but with its fundamental, humoral nature. The preparation of these herbal remedies was a complex art. They were rarely administered in their raw form. Instead, they were transformed into a vast array of medicines. The simplest was an infusion, or a tisane, made by steeping the herb in hot water, what we would now call a tea. A decoction was a stronger preparation, made by boiling the plant, usually the tougher parts like roots or bark, to extract its properties. For external use, herbs were mashed into a poultice or a plaster to be applied directly to the skin. A wound might be dressed with a poultice of comfrey, known as knit bone, to encourage healing, while an inflamed joint could be soothed with a plaster of cooling willow bark. Herbs were also infused in oil or fat to create ointments and salves, which could be rubbed onto the body to deliver their healing properties through the skin. For internal use over a longer period, a syrup would be made by boiling the herb with honey or sugar, which acted as both a preservative and a carrier for the medicine, making the often bitter taste more palatable for the patient. The most potent and expensive preparations were distilled waters and essential oils, created through the alchemical process of distillation, which was believed to concentrate the very essence, the virtue of the plant into a powerful elixir. Beyond the basic humoral properties of plants, many physicians and herbalists subscribed to a fascinating and mystical idea called the doctrine of signatures. This was the belief that God had marked his creations with a sign or a signature indicating their purpose. A plant's appearance, its shape, color, or growing location was a divine clue to its medicinal use. This doctrine provided a beautiful, intuitive, and deeply symbolic way to understand the natural world. For example, the plant known as lungwort had leaves that were speckled and shaped somewhat like a lung. Therefore, it was clearly intended by God to treat respiratory ailments and coughs. The vibrant yellow sap of celandine resembled bile, and so it was used for jaundice and liver problems. Eyebright, a delicate flower with a pattern that looked like a tiny eye, was the go-to remedy for all manner of eye infections. Walnuts, with their hard shell like a skull and a kernel that resembles the two hemispheres of the brain, were used for head injuries and to improve memory. The red juice of St. John's wort was associated with blood, and so it was used to staunch bleeding and heal wounds, its name also linking it to John the Baptist. This was not science as we know it, but a form of sacred pattern recognition, a belief that the world was a divinely written text full of symbols, and that healing was an act of deciphering God's handwriting in the leaves and flowers of the earth. Let us step into the apothecary's shop. The air would be thick with 100 competing aromas, the sharp scent of cloves, the sweet perfume of rosewater, the earthy smell of valerian root, and the pungent tang of dried wormwood. Behind a wooden counter, the apothecary, a skilled and respected craftsman, would be busy with his mortar and pestle, grinding seeds into a fine powder. On the walls would be shelves lined with earthenware jars, wooden boxes, and glass vials, their contents meticulously sourced and prepared. Here one could find not just local herbs, but exotic spices and substances brought from the far corners of the known world via the burgeoning trade routes. There would be cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Spice Islands, and black pepper from India, all prized not just for their flavor, but for their potent warming properties. There might be myrrh and frankincense from Arabia, used as antiseptics and in fumigations to purify the air of miasma. And there would be theriac, the king of all remedies. Theriac was a complex honey-based electuary, a medicinal jam that could contain dozens, sometimes over 100 different ingredients, including herbs, spices, minerals, and most famously, viper's flesh. It was an ancient formula believed to be a universal antidote to poison and a cure-all for a vast range of diseases, especially plague. It was incredibly expensive and difficult to make, a symbol of the apothecary's ultimate skill. The source of many of these herbs, and indeed the intellectual center of herbal medicine for much of the Middle Ages, was the monastery. Within the quiet cloister walls, monks preserved the medical knowledge of the ancient world through the long, dark centuries. Every monastery had an infirmary to care for its own sick monks, and this infirmary was supported by a hortus sanitatis, a garden of health. Here, in carefully tended rectangular beds, the infirmary or monk would cultivate the essential medicinal plants. There would be calming chamomile and lavender, digestive aids like mint and fennel, and fever reducers like feverfew. There would be poppies, from which opium could be extracted for pain relief and to induce sleep, its use carefully controlled. There would be henbane and belladonna, powerful and poisonous plants that in skilled hands could be used as anesthetics or sedatives. The monks were not just gardeners. They were scholars. The monastery library would hold precious copies of classical texts like Dioscorides de Materia Medica and the works of Galen, as well as the writings of later Islamic physicians like Avicenna. The monks painstakingly copied these manuscripts, studied them, and applied their knowledge in their gardens and infirmaries, creating a stable and continuous tradition of herbal healing that served as the bedrock of European medicine. Diet was considered an inseparable part of this herbal therapy. Food was not just sustenance, it was medicine. Just like herbs, every type of food was categorized by its humoral qualities. A physician would provide a patient with a strict dietary regimen designed to support their treatment. For Thomas, the stonemason recovering from his fever, a diet of hot and moist foods would be prescribed to rebuild his sanguine humor. This might include chicken or lamb, considered warming, bread made from good wheat, and red wine. He would be told to avoid cold and dry foods like lentils or beef. A choleric patient, by contrast, would be given cooling and moistening foods like fish, lettuce, cucumber, and barley water, and told to avoid spicy food and red wine, which would only inflame their fiery nature. The act of cooking itself was part of the prescription. Boiling and poaching were considered moistening cooking methods, while roasting and frying were drying. A healthy life was one of constant dietary vigilance, of consciously choosing foods that maintained one's personal humoral balance. Health was not a passive state, but an active, daily practice of eating in accordance with one's own nature and the nature of the world around them. Through this gentle, sustained therapy of herbs and diet, the patient's body, once violently purged, was slowly, carefully, and lovingly coaxed back to a state of eucrasia, the perfect, harmonious balance that was the very definition of health. The lancet may have cleared the battlefield, but it was the quiet power of the Green Dominion that truly won the war. In the sprawling, hierarchical world of medieval society, where every soul had its place in the great chain of being, The act of healing was not entrusted to a single monolithic profession. To seek treatment for an ailment was to enter a complex and often bewildering marketplace of expertise, a world populated by a diverse company of healers, each with their own distinct training, status, social role, and set of skills. The care our stonemason Thomas might have received was not the work of one man, but a collaboration, a relay race of treatment passed between different hands. There was the lofty, university-trained physician who read the stars and the urine, but would never deign to touch a patient with a blade. The humble, yet skilled, barber-surgeon who performed the bloody work of the lancet and the saw. The learned apothecary who stood amidst his fragrant jars, a master of the mysterious arts of compounding. And in the vast spaces beyond the city, walls in the villages and hamlets, the wise woman, the herbalist, the local healer, who, for the vast majority of the population, was the only doctor they would ever know. To understand medieval medicine is to understand this intricate cast of characters, for their divisions, their rivalries, and their surprising collaborations shaped the very experience of sickness and health in the Middle Ages. At the absolute apex of this medical hierarchy stood the university-trained physician. He was a man of letters, a scholar, a member of the intellectual elite. He was more likely to be found in the court of a king or the household of a wealthy merchant than in the squalid bedside of a peasant. His training was long, arduous, and entirely theoretical. After completing the basic liberal arts, a prospective physician would enroll in the medical faculty of one of the great new universities, Salerno, Montpellier, Bologna, Padua, or Paris. Here, he would spend years not dissecting bodies or observing patients, but poring over ancient texts. His education was a deep immersion in the written word, a process of memorizing and debating the canonical works of Hippocrates, the commentaries of Galen, and the great encyclopedias of Islamic scholars like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was the ultimate authority. The goal was not to discover new knowledge, but to master the old, to become a living vessel of classical wisdom. A physician's skill was judged by his ability to quote Galen, to construct a complex diagnosis based on humoral and astrological theory, and to articulate his reasoning in elegant Latin. When this esteemed physician was called to a patient's bedside, his approach was one of detached, intellectual analysis. He would stand at a respectful distance, his fine robes and fur-lined cloak kept well away from the stench and squalor of the sickbed. He would not perform a physical examination in the modern sense. To touch the patient was considered manual, labor beneath his dignity. Instead, he would engage in a series of learned observations. He would receive the flask of urine from a servant, holding it to the light like a fine wine, contemplating its color, turbidity, and sediment to diagnose the specific humoral imbalance. He would inquire about the patient's diet, their temperament, their daily habits. He would listen to descriptions of their symptoms. Critically, he would consult an astrolabe and astrological charts, for the patient's horoscope was considered as vital as their pulse. The alignment of the planets and the position of the moon were believed to exert a powerful influence over the body's humors, and no treatment could succeed if it worked against the will of the cosmos. After this cerebral performance, the physician would render his verdict. He would pronounce the diagnosis, an excess of color, a corruption of phlegm, and prescribe a detailed regimen of treatment. This prescription would cover diet, herbal remedies, and most importantly, instructions for bloodletting or purging. But the physician would never carry out these instructions himself. For the messy, hands-on work, he turned to the next rank in the medical world, the surgeon. The surgeon occupied a much more ambiguous social space. He was a craftsman, not a scholar. His domain was the body itself, its surfaces, its bones, its blood and pus. While the physician dealt in theory, the surgeon dealt in practice. His training came not from university lectures, but from a long and often brutal apprenticeship to a master surgeon. He learned by watching, by holding patients down, and eventually by doing. His knowledge was practical, anatomical, and grounded in the immediate reality of wounds, fractures, and dislocations. Surgeons were often organized into guilds, like other craftsmen such as carpenters or masons, which regulated their training and practice. There was a significant overlap between the professions of the surgeon and the barber. Indeed, the most common type of practitioner was the barber-surgeon. The iconic red and white striped pole we still see today is a direct legacy of this dual profession, the red representing blood, the white representing bandages. The barber, with his sharp razors and steady hand, was already skilled in lancing boils and pulling teeth. It was a natural extension of his trade to take on the more extensive cutting required by medical practice. The barber-surgeon was the man who would be called to let the blood of our stonemason Thomas. He would arrive with his roll of tools, lancets of different sizes, fleams, brass bleeding bowls, and linen bandages. He knew the precise locations on the arm for venesection, and had the practical skill to perform the cut cleanly and efficiently, but his repertoire went far beyond simple bloodletting. The surgeon was the emergency doctor of the medieval world. He was the one called to the scene of an accident or the aftermath of a street brawl. He would clean and stitch wounds, using needles threaded with silk or pig's bristle. He would set broken bones using wooden splints and complex linen bandages, soaked in egg whites to create a hard cast. He was a master of reducing dislocations, forcing a shoulder or a hip back into its socket with a series of terrifying but effective maneuvers. He treated burns, ulcers, and skin diseases. He could remove bladder stones in a risky and excruciating procedure known as lithotomy. And in the most desperate of cases on the battlefield or in the face of a gangrenous limb, he would perform amputations using a heavy saw to cut through bone and a red-hot cautery iron to seal the bleeding stump, a procedure whose agony is almost impossible to imagine. The surgeon's work was visceral, painful, and often heroic, but in the eyes of the educated physician, he was little more than a technician, a pair of hands to be directed from a learned distance. Standing between the physician's prescription and the patient's lips was the third key figure, the apothecary. If the surgeon was a craftsman of the body, the apothecary was a craftsman of remedies. His shop was a crucial fixture in any medieval town, a place of mystery and exotic aromas. The apothecary was a merchant, a chemist, and an herbalist rolled into one. Like the surgeon, he was trained through apprenticeship and organized into a guild, often the same guild as the spice merchants, reflecting the close link between his ingredients and the lucrative spice trade. His primary role was to receive the physician's written prescription and to compound the required medicine. This was a highly skilled task. A single remedy could contain a dozen or more ingredients that needed to be sourced, measured, ground, mixed, and prepared in a specific form, a syrup, an electuary, an ointment, or a distilled water. The apothecary needed a vast knowledge of materia medica, understanding the humoral properties of hundreds of different plants, minerals, and animal products. His shop was a treasure trove of the natural and the exotic. There would be drawers filled with local herbs, chamomile, yarrow, comfrey, but also barrels of expensive imported spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, that were essential warming medicines. There would be jars containing minerals like arsenic and mercury, powerful poisons that were used in tiny quantities as potent drugs. There were animal products of all kinds, powdered crab's eyes as an antacid, fox lungs for respiratory complaints, and the ubiquitous horn of the mythical unicorn, usually the tusk of a narwhal, believed to be a powerful antidote to all poisons. The apothecary was a master of his equipment, the mortar and pestle, the balance scales, the sieves, and, most impressively, the alembic, a glass or copper still used for the delicate process of distillation. The relationship between physician and apothecary was symbiotic but also fraught with tension. Physicians accused apothecaries of overcharging, substituting cheap ingredients, or prescribing remedies themselves, bypassing the physician's authority. Apothecaries, in turn, often possessed a more practical and extensive knowledge of pharmacology than the physicians whose scrawled prescriptions they filled. Beyond this formal trio of physician, surgeon, and apothecary, there existed a vast and largely unchronicled world of folk healers who provided the majority of care to the 90% of the population who lived outside the reach of these urban professionals. In every village there was likely a wise woman or a cunning man, an individual who possessed a deep traditional knowledge of local herbs and healing charms. These folk healers learned their craft through oral tradition, passed down through generations. Their medicine was a pragmatic blend of herbalism, superstition, and common sense. A wise woman, who was often also the local midwife, would know which plants in the surrounding woods and fields could soothe a cough, ease the pain of childbirth, or reduce a fever. She would know how to make a poultice for a swollen joint or a salve for a skin rash. Her practice was not based on the complex humoral theory of the universities, but on generations of empirical knowledge. This plant works for this ailment. Her healing was also deeply intertwined with magic and religion. She might recite a charm over a wound as she dressed it, or time the picking of a certain herb to the phase of the moon. These healers were essential and respected members of their communities, but they were also vulnerable. In a world that increasingly sought to regulate and professionalize medicine, and in an age of growing fear of heresy and witchcraft, their blend of traditional knowledge and magical ritual could easily be viewed with suspicion by church and state authorities. The wise woman's healing touch could, in the eyes of a malevolent neighbor or a zealous inquisitor, become the damning evidence of a pact with the devil. For the common person, however, she was the first and often the only source of comfort and care in a world filled with pain and uncertainty. This rich, complex, and sometimes contentious company of healers, from the Latin spouting physician to the village herbalist, formed the fabric of medieval medicine, each playing their vital part in the universal human struggle against suffering and death. We must now turn our attention from the theoretical world of the physician's library and the fragrant workshop of the apothecary to a place of stark, visceral reality, the surgeon's table. Here, in this space of sawdust, blood, and pain, the abstract theories of medicine collided with the unyielding frailties of the human body. The domain of the medieval surgeon was the domain of the knife, the needle, and the red-hot iron. It was a world of breathtaking courage, both on the part of the practitioner and the patient, a world where the line between healing and butchery was often terrifyingly thin. To modern eyes, accustomed to the sterile, painless, and precise interventions of contemporary surgery, the medieval operating theater seems a chamber of horrors. And yet, to dismiss it as such is to misunderstand its context, and to ignore the remarkable ingenuity and genuine skill that surgeons of the age possessed. They were not butchers. They were highly specialized craftsmen, working at the absolute limit of what was possible in an age without anesthesia, without antiseptics, and with only a rudimentary understanding of human anatomy. Their work on wounds, bones, and ailments of the flesh reveals a pragmatic and often surprisingly effective approach to the grim realities of physical trauma. The single greatest challenge facing any medieval surgeon was the management of pain. There was no general anesthesia. Any procedure, from the setting of a bone to the amputation of a limb, was performed on a fully conscious patient. The experience of surgical pain was not an unfortunate side effect. It was a central, unavoidable, and overwhelming part of the treatment itself. Patients had to be physically restrained, held down by several strong assistants as they writhed and screamed in agony. The speed of the surgeon was therefore his greatest asset. An amputation that could be completed in under a minute was not just a display of technical virtuosity. It was an act of mercy. While there was no perfect solution, surgeons did have a small arsenal of substances to try and dull the senses. The most common was alcohol. Large quantities of strong wine or distilled spirits given to the patient in the hope of inducing a state of stupefied compliance. More sophisticated, but also more dangerous, was the spongia somnifera, or soporific. Sponge. This was a sea sponge soaked in a potent cocktail of narcotic herbs, chief among them opium poppy, henbane, mandrake, and hemlock. The sponge would be dried for storage and, when needed, moistened and held over the patient's nose and mouth. The fumes inhaled would, in theory, induce a state of deep drowsiness or unconsciousness. However, the dosage was incredibly difficult to control. Too little, and the patient would remain awake. Too much, and they could easily die from respiratory depression. The soporific sponge was a high-risk gamble, and many surgeons, fearing it would kill the patient, preferred to rely on brute force and speed alone. The second great challenge was infection. The concept of microbes was non-existent. Infection was not understood as the invasion of the body by microscopic organisms, but in humoral terms. When a wound became inflamed, red, swollen, and produced pus, it was seen as a sign of the body's natural humors becoming corrupted by the injury. Surprisingly, for much of the Middle Ages, the formation of what was called laudable pus, thick, white, odorless pus, was considered a good and necessary part of the healing process. Influential surgeons, following the teachings of Galen, believed that pus was the material evidence of the body expelling the bad humors and poisons from the wound. They would actively encourage suppuration by applying greasy, irritating salves or by packing wounds with lint or horsehair to keep them open. However, this view was not universal. A rising school of more practical surgeons, most notably Theodoric of Lucca in the 13th century, argued for a different approach. Theodoric advocated for meticulous wound hygiene. He insisted that wounds should be cleaned with wine, which, unbeknownst to him, acted as a mild antiseptic due to its alcohol content. He then instructed that the edges of the wound be carefully stitched together, a practice known as healing by first intention, and covered with a clean, wine-soaked bandage. He argued that this method would prevent the formation of pus and lead to faster, cleaner healing. This debate between laudable pus and primary closure was a central intellectual struggle in medieval surgery, a slow and halting step towards the principles of antiseptic practice that were still centuries away. The daily work of the surgeon was dominated by the treatment of wounds, the inevitable consequence of life in a world of sharp tools, heavy labor, and casual violence. A surgeon's skill was judged by his ability to assess a wound and treat it appropriately. He would first have to control the bleeding. For smaller wounds, pressure and bandages would suffice. For larger ones, he might use styptic powders made from astringent herbs, or, in a more dramatic fashion, the cautery iron. The cautery was one of the surgeon's most important and most fearsome tools. It was an iron instrument, often with a specially shaped head that was heated in a charcoal brazier until it glowed red-hot. It was then applied directly to the bleeding vessel or wound. The searing heat would instantly seal the blood vessels and stop the hemorrhage. It was agonizingly painful, but often the only way to prevent a patient from bleeding to death. After controlling the bleeding, the surgeon would probe the wound with his fingers or a metal probe to search for and remove any foreign objects, a splinter of wood, a shard of metal, a piece of dirty cloth. Once clean, the wound would be stitched. Surgeons used a variety of needles, often curved to make sewing easier, and thread made of silk, linen, or even animal gut. They developed sophisticated suturing techniques for different parts of the body, closing gaping wounds on the face with tiny, neat stitches to minimize scarring. Perhaps the most dramatic and mythologized surgical procedure of the age was trepanation. This was the practice of drilling, cutting, or scraping a hole in the skull of a living person. From a modern perspective, it seems an act of unimaginable brutality, but for the medieval surgeon, it was a logical and necessary intervention for a specific set of problems. It was most commonly used for skull fractures, where a piece of bone was pressing on the brain. The surgeon would cut away the scalp, use an elevator to lift the depressed bone fragment, and then use a scraping tool or a cranial drill to create an opening, relieving the pressure on the brain. But it was also used for non-traumatic conditions. In humoral theory, madness, epilepsy, or persistent, severe headaches could be caused by corrupt humors or vapors being trapped within the skull. Trepanation was seen as a way of literally opening a window in the head to allow these noxious substances to escape. While unbelievably risky, skeletal remains show that a surprising number of individuals survived the procedure, with evidence of bone regrowth around the edges of the surgical hole. No less dramatic was the work of the itinerant oculist, a specialized surgeon who traveled from town to town offering to cure blindness caused by cataracts. The procedure, known as couching, was ancient. dating back to Babylon. The oculist would use a special sharp needle or a small knife. With the patient held firmly in place, the oculist would insert the needle into the side of the cornea, push it through to the lens of the eye, which had become opaque with the cataract, and then, with a swift downward flick of the wrist, dislodge the lens, pushing it down and back into the vitreous humor at the bottom of the eyeball. With the opaque lens out of the way, light could once again enter the eye and reach the retina. The patient who had been completely blind could suddenly perceive light and shape again. The results were immediate and seemed miraculous. However, the procedure was fraught with peril. Infection could, and often did, lead to the complete loss of the eye. The unmoored lens could float back into position, or the resulting inflammation could cause permanent blindness. For the desperate, however, the chance to regain even a little sight was a risk worth taking. The ultimate expression of the surgeon's grim art was amputation. In a world without antibiotics, a severe compound fracture or a deeply infected wound could easily lead to gangrene, a condition that was invariably fatal. The only hope for survival was to remove the afflicted limb entirely. The surgeon would first attempt to deaden the limb with a tight tourniquet, which also served to reduce blood flow. The patient would be held down. Using a large, sharp amputation knife, the surgeon would cut through the skin, fat, and muscle in a single circular sweep. Then he would take up the amputation saw and cut through the bone. The entire procedure was a race against time and the patient's endurance. The most critical and most agonizing step came immediately after. An assistant would hand the surgeon the glowing cautery irons from the brazier. One by one, the severed arteries and the bleeding stump would be seared shut. The stench of burning flesh would fill the air. If the patient survived the shock, the pain, and the blood loss of the procedure itself, they then faced the immense risk of the stump becoming infected. The surgeon would dress the stump with bandages, soaked in wine or herbal solutions, and pray that his patient would have the strength to endure. The skill and fortitude required to perform such an act, and the sheer desperation of the patient willing to undergo it, speak volumes about the brutal realities of medieval life and medicine. While their methods were crude and their tools terrifying, these surgeons stood on the front line against trauma and death, armed with little more than a knife, an iron, and an unshakable nerve. In our exploration of medieval medicine, we have walked through the physician's study, the surgeon's bloody theater, and the apothecary's fragrant shop. Yet, to truly understand the medieval experience of illness, we must enter another, far more pervasive institution, the house of God. For the medieval mind, the body and the soul were not separate entities, but a single integrated whole. Sickness was never just a matter of imbalanced humors. It was a profound spiritual event. It could be a punishment from God for sin, a trial sent to test one's faith, or a demonic affliction visited upon the unwary. Consequently, healing was not just a medical process, but a religious one. The priest was as important as the physician, and prayer was as vital a remedy as any herbal potion. This fusion of the physical and the spiritual found its ultimate expression in the monastery infirmary, the true ancestor of the modern hospital, and in the popular belief in the healing power of saints, relics, and holy shrines, which formed a vast parallel healthcare system based not on Galen, but on God. The foundational concept of this spiritual medicine was the idea of Christus Medicus, Christ, the physician. In the Gospels, Christ healed the sick, cured the blind, and cleansed the lepers. For medieval Christians, these were not just stories, they were a template for living. The care of the sick was a fundamental religious duty, an act of Christian charity, caritas, that was essential for the salvation of one's soul. This belief was enshrined in the rule of Saint Benedict, the 6th century document that laid out the blueprint for Western monasticism. Benedict's rule contained a specific and powerful injunction: before all things and above all things, care must be taken of the sick. He instructed that a special building, the infirmary, be set aside for their care, and that a monk, the infirmer, be appointed to look after them with the same reverence as if he were attending to Christ himself. This commandment transformed the monastery into the most important center for institutionalized medicine in the early Middle Ages, a sanctuary for the sick that offered a level of care simply unavailable in the secular world. The monastery infirmary was a world unto itself, a quiet space of order and contemplation dedicated to healing. It was typically a large, airy hall, often built with a high ceiling and large windows to allow for good ventilation and light. A practical design based on ancient Roman military hospital principles. Beds would be lined up along the walls, each with a mattress stuffed with straw or wool, clean linen sheets, and a blanket. There was a dedicated chapel within or attached to the infirmary, so that the sick could hear the daily Mass and participate, as much as possible, in the spiritual life of the monastery. This was crucial, for the healing process was seen as twofold. The body was tended to, but the soul was the primary concern. The infirmary monk was the heart of this institution. He was chosen for his compassionate nature and his practical skills. He was the monastery's doctor, nurse, and pharmacist combined. His day was a seamless blend of prayer and practice. He would recite psalms and prayers for the recovery of his patients, but he would also take their pulse, examine their urine, and prepare their medicines. Adjacent to the infirmary was the monastery's greatest contribution to practical medicine, the Hortus Sanitatis, or Garden of Health. As we have seen, this was no ordinary vegetable patch. It was a living pharmacy, a meticulously organized collection of medicinal plants, cultivated with skill and deep knowledge. The infirmer would walk these quiet paths, gathering the ingredients for his remedies: rose petals for cooling syrups, poppy heads for a pain-relieving draught, comfrey leaves for a poultice to mend broken bones. The knowledge to use these plants was preserved and expanded in the monastery scriptorium. Here, amidst silence and scholarly devotion, monks spent their lives painstakingly copying and illuminating ancient medical texts. They preserved the works of Hippocrates and Galen, ensuring this classical knowledge survived the collapse of the Roman Empire. They also wrote their own works, creating herbals and medical compendiums that blended classical theory with practical local knowledge. The scriptorium and the garden were two halves of the same whole, a union of ancient authority and hands-on experience that made the monastery the intellectual powerhouse of early medieval medicine. The care provided was holistic. The patient received a carefully prepared diet from the monastery kitchen, herbal remedies from the infirmary, and constant spiritual comfort from the rhythms of monastic prayer, while monasteries initially cared only for their own sick monks. Their charitable mandate led many to open their doors to the lay public, especially the poor and pilgrims. Over time, these monastic infirmaries evolved into the first true hospitals. The famous Hôtel Dieu in Paris, for example, began as a church-run institution in the 7th century. These hospitals were not, however, places of active treatment in the modern sense. A university physician might be attached to a large urban hospital, but the day-to-day care was provided by religious orders of monks or nuns. The primary focus was on hospitality, providing shelter, food, warmth, and spiritual solace to the sick and dying. It was palliative care on a grand scale. For the poor, falling ill often meant being cast out, unable to work, and with no family to provide support. The hospital was a safety net, a place to be looked after, to be fed, and most often to die in a state of grace, having received the last rites. For many, the greatest healing the hospital could offer was not for the body, but for the soul, ensuring a safe passage into the next life. For the common person, however, direct access to a physician or even a hospital was rare. Their health care was more likely to be found at the intersection of folk belief and popular religion. When sickness struck after the local wise woman's herbs had been tried, the next step was to appeal to a higher power, not just God in a general sense, but to a specific heavenly intermediary, a saint. Saints were seen as powerful patrons and protectors in the celestial court, individuals who had a direct line to God and could intercede on behalf of a suffering mortal. Many saints had specific medical specialties. Saint Roch, who had survived the plague, was the great protector against pestilence. Saint Lucy, whose eyes were gouged out in her martyrdom, was invoked for all ailments of the eye. Saint Blaise, who miraculously saved a boy choking on a fishbone, was the patron saint of throat diseases. Saint Anthony the Great was prayed to for relief from the agonizing skin condition known as Saint Anthony's fire, or ergotism. A person suffering from a particular illness would direct their prayers, vows, and offerings to the relevant saint. This belief gave rise to the practice of pilgrimage, a central feature of medieval life. A pilgrimage to the shrine of a healing saint was a powerful medical act. The journey itself, often arduous and spanning hundreds of miles, was seen as an act of penance and devotion. The ultimate goal was to reach the saint's holy shrine, which almost always contained a sacred relic, a piece of the saint's bone, a lock of hair, a fragment of their clothing, or an object they had touched. These relics were believed to be conduits of divine power, physical objects charged with the saint's healing grace. Upon arriving at the shrine, which might be a great cathedral like Canterbury or a small local chapel, a pilgrim would pray, make an offering, and if possible, touch or kiss the reliquary containing the sacred object. They might leave behind a small wax model of the afflicted body part, a leg, an arm, an eye, a votive offering in thanks or in hope for a cure. The accounts of miraculous healings at these shrines are legion. The sick would suddenly rise from their litters, the blind would regain their sight, the lame would cast aside their crutches. Historians today might interpret these events in terms of psychosomatic cures, the power of suggestion or spontaneous remission, but to the medieval mind, they were straightforward proof of God's power working through his saints. These shrines constituted a vast, continent-wide network of healing centers. They were accessible to everyone, from kings to peasants. This system of divine medicine did not necessarily compete with humoral medicine. It complemented it. A person might simultaneously consult a physician to balance their humors while praying to a saint to purify their soul. Illness was a multifaceted crisis, and it required a multifaceted response. The physician treated the body, but the priest, and the saint treated the deeper spiritual malady that was the ultimate cause of the suffering. In the medieval world, the chirping of birds in the monastery garden, the quiet scratching of a monk's quill in the scriptorium, and the fervent prayers of a pilgrim at a dusty shrine were all integral parts of the same eternal human quest for healing and wholeness. We have spent our journey thus far in a world largely dominated by men: the male physician, the male surgeon, the male monk. But there is a vast and vital realm of medieval medicine that we have left unexplored, a realm that was almost exclusively the domain of women. This was the world of female health, a universe centered on the profound and perilous processes of menstruation, conception, pregnancy, and, above all, childbirth. In an age where a woman's primary social and religious role was to bear children, these biological functions defined her existence. Yet for the male-dominated medical establishment, the female body was a source of mystery, anxiety, and profound misunderstanding. The university-trained physicians, with their bookish theoretical knowledge, had little practical experience and even less interest in the messy, intimate realities of gynecology and obstetrics. This created a space, a vacuum of practice, that was filled by one of the most important and historically overlooked figures in the history of medicine, the midwife. She was the expert, the authority, and the indispensable guardian of women's health, a practitioner whose skill was born not of Latin texts, but of shared experience, oral tradition, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of women. For the medieval woman, the act of childbirth was the most dangerous moment of her life. It was a terrifying ordeal where the prospect of death, for both mother and child, was ever present. Maternal and infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. The process was rightly known as labor, and the birthing room as the chamber of travail. When a woman's time came, she did not go to a hospital. She entered a uniquely female space, her own bedchamber, transformed into a sacred and private arena. All men, including her husband, were typically banished from the room. This was a woman's world, presided over by her mother, her sisters, her female neighbors, and at the center of it all, the midwife. The midwife was a respected and sometimes feared figure in the community. She was usually an older woman, often a widow who had borne children herself and had attended countless births. Her authority was absolute. She was the commander of the birthing chamber, her voice a source of comfort, encouragement, and firm instruction. The midwife's toolkit was one of practical wisdom. She would prepare the birthing room, ensuring it was warm with a good fire, going as warmth was believed to ease the process. She would have clean linens ready and prepare special birthing girdles, often inscribed with prayers and charms to be tied around the laboring woman's abdomen. Her approach was holistic, attending to the mother's physical and spiritual needs. She would offer sips of wine or herbal infusions, like raspberry leaf tea, to strengthen contractions and ease pain. She would massage the woman's back and abdomen with oils. Crucially, she would manage the labor itself, checking the dilation of the cervix by touch and instructing the mother when to push and when to rest. She was a master of different birthing positions. Unlike the modern stereotype of a woman lying on her back, medieval mothers were encouraged to adopt positions that made use of gravity, kneeling, squatting, leaning against another woman, or sitting in a special U-shaped birthing stool that the midwife often brought with her. Her calm and experienced presence was her most important instrument, guiding the mother through the waves of pain and fear. When complications arose, the midwife's true skill was tested. If the baby was in a difficult position, a breech or transverse lie, she would attempt to manually turn the infant in the womb, a highly skilled and delicate procedure. She would anoint her hands with oil and carefully reach into the birth canal to try and reposition the child. If the labor stalled, she would use various techniques to try and induce stronger contractions, from administering pungent herbs to make the mother sneeze, to shaking the bedsheets in a violent snap. These interventions were a desperate gamble. If the baby could not be turned, or if the mother's pelvis was too narrow, the outcome was almost always tragic. In a case of obstructed labor, the mother and child would both perish after days of agonizing effort. The male surgeon was only ever called in as a last resort, when the mother was already dead or dying. In such a grim scenario, he would perform a rudimentary cesarean section, not to save the infant's life, which was considered impossible, but to baptize the child before it died in the womb, thus saving its soul. The surgeon's arrival at a birth was a sign of utter catastrophe. If the birth was successful, the midwife's duties continued. Her first act upon the baby's arrival was to check for signs of life and, if necessary, to clear the infant's airways and stimulate breathing. She would then recite a prayer of thanks. A critical task was the cutting of the umbilical cord. She would tie it off with a clean linen thread and cut it with a special knife, often leaving a specific length based on tradition. She would then wash the newborn, rub its skin with salt to toughen it, and swaddle it tightly in linen bands, a practice believed to ensure the limbs grew straight and strong. Her attention would then turn back to the mother. She had to manage the delivery of the placenta, the afterbirth, ensuring it was expelled completely, as a retained placenta could lead to fatal hemorrhage or infection. She would then clean and soothe the mother, stitch any perennial tears with a fine needle and thread, and bind her abdomen to help the uterus contract. She would continue to visit in the days following the birth, offering advice on breastfeeding, monitoring the health of both mother and child, and preparing nourishing foods like caudle, a warm spiced gruel of wine or ale, to help the mother regain her strength. While the practice of midwifery was based on oral tradition, this does not mean it was entirely without a written counterpart. The most important and fascinating medical text concerning women's health in the Middle Ages was a collection of works known as the Trotula. Originating in the great medical center of Salerno in the 12th century, the Trotula was a compendium of practical advice on gynecology, obstetrics, and even cosmetics. Though for centuries it was attributed to a single female physician named Trota of Salerno, modern scholarship suggests it is a compilation of 3 different texts. What made the Trotula so revolutionary was its focus on women's health, from a woman's perspective. It discussed the menstrual cycle, problems with fertility, and signs of pregnancy with a frankness and practical detail that was absent from the works of male physicians. It offered recipes for herbs to regulate periods, to increase fertility, and to ease the pains of labor. It gave detailed instructions for midwives on how to handle difficult births, including how to support the perineum to prevent tearing and how to manage a breech presentation. The Trotula did not just cover childbirth. It was a comprehensive guide to women's health care. It contained diagnoses and treatments for a wide range of gynecological conditions, such as uterine prolapse or vaginal infections, often with herbal remedies that were both sophisticated and effective. It also demonstrated a remarkable empathy for women's concerns, including a section on cosmetics. It provided recipes for whitening the skin, smoothing wrinkles, dyeing hair, and removing unwanted body hair. This was not seen as mere vanity. The text argued that beauty was a sign of good health and a harmonious bodily constitution, and that helping a woman to maintain her appearance was a legitimate and important part of the healer's art. The Trotula was immensely popular, copied and translated across Europe, becoming the essential handbook for any practitioner, male or female, who dealt with the health of women. It provided a theoretical and written authority for a field that was otherwise entirely practical and hands-on. Despite their essential role, the position of the midwife was precarious. She held life and death in her hands, and while a successful birth brought her praise, a fatal one could bring accusations of incompetence or, more dangerously, of witchcraft. As the medical profession began to organize itself more formally into guilds and universities in the later Middle Ages, midwives were deliberately excluded. They were women, they couldn't read Latin, and their knowledge was not the sanctioned wisdom of Galen. Male physicians began to write condescendingly about the ignorance of midwives, seeking to assert their own authority over the lucrative field of childbirth, even though they themselves lacked the practical skills. Furthermore, the midwife's use of traditional charms and herbal remedies, combined with her intimate knowledge of women's bodies and her role in the secret, female-only space of the birthing chamber, made her an object of suspicion to church authorities. She was often accused of propagating superstitions or, in the darkest cases, of being able to procure abortions or of offering stillborn infants to the devil. The wise woman at the bedside could, with a subtle shift of perception, become the witch at the Sabbath. And yet, for all these institutional pressures and dangers, the midwife remained. She was indispensable. For countless medieval women, she was the calm voice in the storm, the skilled hands in the darkness, the keeper of the secrets of a woman's lot. The medical system we have been exploring, this intricate dance of humors, herbs, and heavenly aid, was designed to confront the individual. It was a medicine for a stonemason's fever, a noblewoman's melancholy, a monk's infected wound. It was personal, patient-centered, and built upon a foundation of ancient ordered theory. But in the middle of the 14th century, this entire system, this entire worldview, was confronted by a catastrophe so immense, so sudden, and so incomprehensibly lethal that it shattered the foundations of medieval society and challenged every accepted notion of sickness and healing. This was the Black Death, the Great Pestilence, a pandemic that swept across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe with the speed and fury of a divine judgment. In the face of this indiscriminate killer, the physician's uroscopy flask, the surgeon's lancet, and the herbalist's remedies proved utterly useless. The plague was a great leveler, striking down rich and poor, pious and sinner with terrifying impartiality. The failure of medieval medicine to explain or contain this apocalypse was a moment of profound crisis, but it was also, paradoxically, a catalyst. From the ashes of the Black Death would rise the first, faint glimmers of a new way of thinking about disease, not as an individual imbalance, but as a collective threat that required a collective public response. The theoretical framework for understanding epidemic disease before the plague was the theory of miasma. While individual illness was caused by an internal humoral imbalance, widespread pestilence was believed to be caused by an external corruption of the air itself. This miasma, or bad air, was thought to rise from foul, decaying organic matter from swamps, stagnant water, open sewers, and unburied corpses. It was also believed to be influenced by malign astrological conjunctions, such as the alignment of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, which were thought to poison the atmosphere. When a person breathed in this corrupt air, it would penetrate the body and disrupt the humors on a massive scale, leading to swift and deadly disease. This theory, while incorrect, was the dominant explanation for the Black Death. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, in a famous report to the King of France in 1348, officially blamed the plague on a triple conjunction of planets in the sign of Aquarius, which had caused a deadly corruption of the air of the earth. Armed with this theory, physicians prescribed a series of preventative measures based on purifying the air and strengthening the individual's body against its corrupting influence. The wealthy fled the crowded, stinking cities for the clean air of their country estates, a strategy that was, by chance, one of the most effective, as it removed them from the fleas and rats that were the true carriers of the disease. For those who had to remain, physicians advised a range of preventative measures. People were told to stay indoors, to seal their windows, and to fumigate their houses by burning aromatic woods like juniper and ash, or fragrant herbs like rosemary and lavender. They carried posies of flowers or pomander, small metal balls, filled with ambergris, musk, and spices, which they held to their noses when walking through the streets, hoping the sweet scent would ward off the deadly miasma. Bonfires were lit in public squares to purify the air on a grand scale. On a personal level, doctors advised moderation in all things, diet, exercise, even bathing, lest any excess should open the body to the poison. They prescribed warming, aromatic foods and potent cordials made from spices and expensive substances, like theriac, hoping to bolster the body's natural heat and resist the pestilential vapor. But when the disease struck, all these preventative measures proved futile. The Black Death manifested in two primary forms. The first and most common was bubonic plague. After an incubation period of a few days, the victim would be seized by a violent fever, chills, and vomiting. Soon after, the characteristic buboes would appear hard, painful, and rapidly swelling lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes, from which the plague gets its name, were the body's attempt to contain the infection. They would grow to the size of an egg or an apple, their skin stretching tight and turning a dark, purplish black. The pain was excruciating. This was followed by septicemic plague, where the bacteria Yersinia pestis overwhelmed the bloodstream, causing high fever, shock, and widespread bleeding under the skin, which turned the victim's skin dark, hence the name Black Death. Form was almost universally fatal. The third and most terrifying form was pneumonic plague, which occurred when the infection settled in the lungs. This caused a bloody cough and allowed the disease to be transmitted directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, without the need for a flea bite. It was swift, devastatingly contagious, and 100% fatal. The sheer speed and lethality of the plague overwhelmed the medical system. Physicians, surgeons, and priests died at the same rate as the general populace, if not faster, due to their close contact with the sick. Many, terrified for their own lives, simply refused to treat plague victims. Those who did, like the heroic Guy de Chauliac, physician to the Pope in Avignon, found that their traditional methods were powerless. De Chauliac described lancing the buboes, a standard surgical procedure to release pus, but noted that it did little good. He tried bloodletting, but it only seemed to weaken the patient further. He prescribed his finest theriac, but the plague cut down those who took it as easily as those who did not. The failure was total and undeniable. The intricate, logical system of humoral medicine, which could so elegantly explain a common fever, had no answer to this onslaught. The psychological impact was immense. If the most learned physicians in Christendom could do nothing, then what hope was there? For many, the only explanation left was that this was not a natural disease, but the wrath of God, a second great flood sent to punish a sinful world. This sense of divine punishment led to mass religious hysteria. Processions of flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron, believing that by mortifying their own flesh, they could appease God's anger and avert the plague. They were a terrifying spectacle, and while initially welcomed, they were soon seen as dangerous rabble-rousers who only helped to spread the disease further. In the absence of a rational explanation, people searched for scapegoats. Rumors flew that the wells had been poisoned, and suspicion fell upon the most vulnerable and ostracized group in European society, the Jews. Despite the fact that Jewish communities were dying from the plague at the same rate as Christian ones, a wave of horrific pogroms swept across Europe, especially in Germany and France. Thousands of Jews were tortured into false confessions and then burned alive, their communities annihilated in an outburst of fear, hatred, and mass delusion. Yet amidst this chaos, terror, and failure, the seeds of a new idea were sown. The sheer scale of the Black Death forced civic authorities, for the first time, to think about disease not as a private misfortune, but as a public problem requiring an organized state-level response. This was the birth of public health. Seeing that the disease seemed to travel with ships and merchants, the port city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, in 1377, implemented a revolutionary new policy. All arriving ships and travelers from plague-affected areas were required to wait on a nearby island for 30 days, Trentino, to prove they were not sick before they could enter the city. This period was later extended to 40 days, ora quarantino, from which we derive our word quarantine. This was a radical idea. It was the first time a healthy person was legally isolated based on potential exposure to a disease. It was a purely pragmatic measure, based on observation, not on humoral theory. It was an admission that some contagion, passed between people. The Italian city-states, which were at the hub of Mediterranean trade, led the way in developing these new public health measures. Cities like Venice and Florence established permanent boards of health, committees of magistrates given extraordinary powers during an epidemic. These boards could enforce quarantines, shut down markets, and arrange for the burial of the dead in mass plague pits outside the city walls, a grim but necessary measure to deal with the overwhelming number of corpses. They established special plague hospitals, called lazarettos, usually on islands, whose sole purpose was to isolate and care for plague victims, separating them from the general population. They hired special plague doctors, often second-rate physicians or young men willing to take the risk, who were paid by the city to treat the sick. These doctors were identifiable by their famous and terrifying costume, which became fully developed in the 17th century, but had its origins in this period. The costume consisted of a long, waxed canvas gown, gloves, and most famously, a beak-like mask filled with aromatic herbs. The beak was designed to protect the doctor from the miasmatic air, filtering it through a perfumed barrier. While based on a false theory, the gown and gloves may have offered some limited protection from flea bites and respiratory droplets. These measures were draconian and authoritarian, but they represented a fundamental shift in thinking, the idea that the state had a right and a duty to protect the health of its entire population, even if it meant restricting individual liberty. The Black Death exposed the impotence of medieval medicine, but in doing so, it forced society to grope its way towards a new paradigm, one based on observation, containment, and the collective management of disease. Our journey through the medieval medical landscape has thus far focused on the afflictions of the body, on fevers, wounds, plagues, and the perils of childbirth. But what of the mind? What happened when the illness was not a visible lesion or a measurable fever, but a disturbance of thought, emotion, and behavior? In the medieval world, there was no separate discipline of psychiatry. The care of the mind was woven into the fabric of medicine, philosophy, and, most powerfully, theology. The chamber of the mind was a mysterious and often frightening place, and its afflictions were interpreted through the familiar lens of humoral theory, but also through the far more potent frameworks of morality and spirituality. Madness or frenzy was a terrifying loss of reason, while the more subtle but pervasive ailment of melancholy was a deep-seated sorrow of the soul. The response to these conditions was as varied as their perceived causes, ranging from gentle dietary counsel and music therapy to harsh physical restraint and solemn religious exorcism. To explore medieval attitudes toward mental illness is to explore their deepest anxieties about the nature of humanity, the fragility of reason, and the constant battle between the divine and the demonic for the soul of man. The primary scientific explanation for mental affliction was, unsurprisingly, rooted in the theory of the four humors. The brain, it was believed, was the seat of reason and the rational soul. Its proper functioning depended on a balanced and healthy humoral state. When this balance was disrupted, the mind would suffer. An excess of hot, dry, yellow bile or choler could boil in the head, leading to many a state of frenzied rage, aggression, and irrational behavior. This was often called phrenesis. Conversely, a predominance of cold, moist phlegm could lead to lethargy, stupor, and a dullness of the senses, a condition akin to what we might now call severe depression or catatonia, but the most complex, nuanced, and culturally significant of the mental ailments was melancholy. This condition was attributed to an excess of the fourth humor, black bile. The word melancholy itself comes from the Greek melas for black and chol for bile. Black bile was the most feared of the humors. It was cold and dry, like the earth in winter, and was associated with the season of autumn, old age, and the planet Saturn. When black bile became corrupt or excessive, it was believed to emit a dark, sooty vapor that would rise up and cloud the brain, extinguishing the light of reason and plunging the individual into a state of profound sadness, fear, and intellectual obsession. The symptoms of melancholy were described in medieval texts with remarkable psychological insight. They included persistent sadness, tearfulness, social withdrawal, and a loss of pleasure in all activities. But it was also associated with a host of other symptoms: irrational fears and phobias, obsessive thoughts, paranoia, and even vivid hallucinations. The melancholic might believe they were made of glass and would shatter if touched, or that they had swallowed a frog that was now living in their stomach. Robert Burton, in his much later but deeply medieval in spirit masterpiece, The Anatomy of Melancholy, would catalog these strange delusions with fascinating precision. Importantly, melancholy was not seen as a simple sadness. It was a complex and ambiguous condition. While it was a dangerous illness, it was also associated with genius, deep thought, and artistic creativity. The melancholic temperament, governed by Saturn, was linked to scholars, philosophers, and contemplative monks. It was the affliction of intellectuals, the scholar's disease. This gave melancholy a strange sort of prestige, a mark of a sensitive and profound soul. Even as it tormented its victims, the treatment for these humoral imbalances of the mind followed the established principles of medieval medicine. The physician's goal was to restore equilibrium through diet, herbal remedies, and evacuation. For a manic patient suffering from an excess of hot choler, the treatment was to cool and moisten the body. They would be prescribed a diet of cooling, foods like cucumbers, melons, and fish. They would be given cooling herbs like water lily and violet. Bloodletting from the forehead was also common, in the belief that it would directly drain the excess heat from the brain. For the melancholic patient, the goal was the opposite: to warm and moisten the body, to counteract the cold, dry nature of the black bile. They were prescribed a diet of warming foods like lamb, chicken, and good wine. They were encouraged to take warm baths infused with mallow and other moistening herbs. Herbal remedies included borage and balm, plants that were believed to make the heart merry and lift the spirits. Purging, especially with laxatives like hellebore, was also used to try and cleanse the body of the corrupt black bile. Beyond these physical interventions, physicians recognized a profound connection between the mind and its environment. They prescribed what we might now call lifestyle changes or therapies. Melancholics were advised to avoid solitude, which was believed to deepen their dark thoughts. They were encouraged to seek out pleasant company, to listen to beautiful music, and to engage in gentle conversation. The air they breathed was considered important. They were told to seek out places with clear, bright air full of light and pleasant smells. Gardens were seen as particularly therapeutic spaces. The beauty of the flowers, the gentle sound of a fountain, and the sweet scent of the air were all considered powerful medicines for a troubled spirit. Music therapy was widely prescribed. Different modes of music were believed to have different effects on the humors, and a skilled musician could play melodies designed to soothe a manic soul or to elevate a melancholic one. These were gentle and humane approaches, recognizing that the state of the soul was tied to the sensory experiences of the body. However, there was a much darker side to the medieval understanding of mental illness. When a person's behavior became too erratic, violent, or socially disruptive, their condition was often interpreted not as a simple humoral imbalance, but as a spiritual crisis. The line between madness and demonic possession was often blurry. A person suffering from epileptic seizures, or speaking in a nonsensical way, or exhibiting extreme, uncontrollable rage, could easily be seen as being controlled by a malevolent spirit. In these cases, the physician stepped aside for the priest. The treatment was not a change in diet, but the solemn rite of exorcism. The afflicted individual would be brought to a church or a shrine where a priest would pray over them, sprinkle them with holy water, and command the demon to depart in the name of God. This was a terrifying and powerful ritual, and for a person whose suffering was rooted in deep-seated guilt or spiritual anxiety, the psychological impact of such a ceremony could be profound, sometimes leading to a perceived cure. For those whose madness was chronic and violent, and for whom no treatment seemed to work, society's response was one of containment. The frenzied madman was a figure of fear. They were seen as having lost their reason, the very faculty that made them human. They were reduced to the level of a wild animal and were often treated as such. Families might keep a disturbed relative locked away in a cellar or an attic. In some towns they were rounded up and expelled, cast out to wander the countryside as vagrants. In other cases, they were confined in institutions. While some monasteries and hospitals did offer compassionate care, the first institutions dedicated specifically to the insane, like the Bethlehem Hospital in London, which would become infamous as Bedlam, were often little more than prisons. Here the mad were chained to walls, kept in squalid conditions, and subjected to harsh physical treatments designed to shock the system back into order. These included dunking the patient in ice-cold water, spinning them in rotating chairs until they lost consciousness, and severe beatings. These were not necessarily acts of sadistic cruelty, but desperate measures born of fear and a belief that the beast within had to be subdued by force before reason could be restored. The public was often allowed to visit these asylums for a small fee, to gaze upon the inmates as a form of moral entertainment, a cautionary spectacle of what happens when reason is lost. Yet, even in this grim picture, there were pockets of surprising compassion. In some communities, the holy fool or the innocent was seen not as a threat, but as one of God's special children, whose lack of reason made them pure and closer to the divine. They were allowed to wander freely, and were often fed and cared for by the community as an act of collective charity. The town of Geel in modern-day Belgium became a famous center for the humane care of the mentally ill from the 13th century onwards. According to legend, the town housed the relics of Saint Dymphna, an Irish princess who was martyred after fleeing her incestuous father. She became the patron saint of the mentally ill, and a tradition developed in Deal where psychiatric patients were not locked away, but were boarded with local families. They lived as part of the family, participated in daily life, and were treated with kindness and acceptance. This remarkable system, a form of community care centuries ahead of its time, stands as a powerful testament to a different path, one that chose compassion over confinement. The medieval approach to the troubled mind was a complex tapestry of contradictions, of sophisticated psychological theory and brutal physical restraint, of gentle herbal remedies and terrifying exorcisms, of social ostracism and profound community care. It reveals a society grappling with the deepest questions of what it means to be human, sane, and whole. Our long journey through the world of medieval medicine is drawing to a close. We have seen a system of immense intellectual complexity, a stable and self-contained universe built on the twin pillars of ancient Greek philosophy and Christian faith. For over 1,000 years, the four humors of Galen had provided the definitive map of the human body, a map that guided every diagnosis, every prescription, and every intervention. But no system, no matter how venerable, can last forever. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the world was changing at a dizzying pace. The Renaissance was in full bloom, rediscovering not just the texts of antiquity, but its spirit of inquiry and observation. The printing press was spreading new ideas with unprecedented speed. Explorers were discovering new continents, new plants, and new peoples that did not fit within the old maps. And within this ferment of revolution, the ancient edifice of humoral medicine began to show its first fateful cracks. The challenge came not from a single discovery, but from a new way of thinking, a new confidence in direct experience over inherited authority, a change embodied by one of the most bombastic, revolutionary, and influential figures in the history of medicine, the man known as Paracelsus. The twilight of the humoral system began quietly in the anatomy theaters of Italian universities. For centuries, human dissection had been rare and highly ritualized. A professor would sit on a high chair, reading aloud from the anatomical texts of Galen, while a lowly barber-surgeon performed the actual dissection on the corpse below, pointing out the organs as they were mentioned in the text. The purpose was not to discover anything new, but simply to demonstrate the truth of the ancient master's words. If the corpse on the table appeared to contradict the words of Galen, it was assumed that the corpse was deformed, or that the human body had changed since Roman times. The text was always considered more reliable than the evidence of one's own eyes, but a new generation of anatomists began to look more closely. Most notably, Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist working in Padua in the 1530s, decided to trust his own observations over the sacred texts. He performed his own dissections, meticulously documenting what he actually saw. In his groundbreaking 1543 masterpiece, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, Vesalius showed that Galen, who had based most of his anatomy on the dissection of apes and pigs, had been wrong about hundreds of specific details of human anatomy. Vesalius did not overthrow humoral theory itself, but his work dealt it a devastating blow. He proved that Galen, the infallible authority, could be wrong. He championed the idea that knowledge must come from direct observation from the body itself, not just from ancient books. The Fabrica, with its stunningly detailed and beautiful woodcut illustrations, opened up the human body to direct inquiry as never before. While Vesalius was challenging Galen on the structure of the body, a far more radical challenger was attacking the very foundation of his theory of disease. This was Theophrastus von Hohenheim, who gave himself the defiant name Paracelsus, meaning beyond Celsus, a famous Roman encyclopedist. Paracelsus was a Swiss-German physician, alchemist, and philosopher, a man of monumental ego and even greater influence. He was a wanderer, a drunkard, and a rebel who delighted in offending the medical establishment. He publicly burned the works of Galen and Avicenna, declaring that his own shoelaces knew more than those ancient physicians. He rejected the four humors as the cause of disease. For Paracelsus, disease was not a general imbalance of the whole system, but a specific, localized affliction of a particular organ caused by an external agent that had invaded the body. He famously declared, "The poison is the dose." This meant that health and illness were a matter of chemistry. He believed the world and the body were made of three essential alchemical principles: salt, representing stability; sulfur, representing inflammability; and mercury, representing fluidity. Sickness was a chemical imbalance, a mistake, in the chemistry of a specific organ. This new theory of disease demanded a new kind of treatment. If sickness was chemical, then the cure must also be chemical. Paracelsus rejected the gentle, balancing, herbal remedies of the Galenic tradition, which he called soup pot medicine. He championed a new, aggressive form of treatment based on potent, purified chemical substances. This was the birth of iatrochemistry, or chemical medicine. Paracelsus was a master alchemist. Alchemy is often caricatured as a foolish attempt to turn lead into gold, but it was much more than that. It was a complex spiritual and practical art aimed at understanding the processes of transformation in nature. Alchemists were the first, true laboratory chemists, masters of distillation, sublimation, and precipitation. Paracelsus turned these alchemical skills towards medicine. He believed that every natural substance contained a pure, active essence, its arcanum or virtue, which was trapped within its impure earthly body. The job of the alchemical physician was to use fire and acid to burn away the impurities and isolate this pure essence. He would take a poisonous mineral like antimony or mercury and through a series of chemical processes transform it into a powerful medicine. His approach was revolutionary and terrifying to his contemporaries. He was prescribing poisons as cures. He created Loadam, a tincture of opium and alcohol, which became one of the most effective and widely used painkillers for centuries. He used mercury to treat syphilis, a devastating new disease that had appeared in Europe in the late 15th century. The traditional humoral treatments had been useless against it, but Paracelsus's chemical therapy, while highly toxic and dangerous, was often effective. He argued that since the disease was a specific poison, it must be fought with a specific counterpoison. This was a radical departure from the Galenic idea of treating with opposites. Paracelsus was treating like with like, or rather fighting a specific enemy with a specific weapon. This was the dawn of pharmacology as we know it, the search for a magic bullet that could target a specific disease without destroying the rest of the body. His work was hugely controversial. He was hailed by his followers as a medical Luther, a reformer who swept away the corrupt old traditions. He was condemned by the academic physicians as a dangerous quack, a charlatan who was poisoning his patients. But the genie could not be put back in the bottle. Paracelsus had shown that chemical interventions could produce powerful, undeniable results. The 17th century saw the final decline of the humoral system among the intellectual elite. The English physician William Harvey, another disciple of the Paduan school of anatomy, demonstrated in 1628 that blood circulated through the body, pumped by the heart. This directly contradicted Galen's theory that blood was produced in the liver and consumed by the tissues. The invention of the microscope revealed a hidden world of tiny, swimming animalcules, a discovery that would, centuries later, lead to the germ theory of disease. New philosophies, like the rationalism of René Descartes, who saw the body as a complex machine, and the empiricism of Francis Bacon, who championed experimental science, provided a new intellectual framework that had no place for the ancient. Humors. Medicine slowly and painstakingly began to rebuild itself on new foundations, on anatomy, on chemistry, and on experimental observation. Yet, the old ways died hard. The twilight of the humors was a long one. While elite, university-trained physicians were embracing the new science, the practice of medicine for the vast majority of people remained deeply traditional. Bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies, based on humoral qualities, continued to be the standard of care well into the 18th and even 19th centuries. The language of humors and temperaments has lingered in our culture to this day. We still speak of a person being in a good humor or having a sanguine personality. We describe someone as choleric or melancholic. These are the ghosts of a once mighty system, faint echoes of a time when all of life, all of health and sickness was understood through the elegant, ordered dance of the four essential fluids. The shift from this ancient system to our modern one was not a clean break, but a messy, centuries-long transition. It was a journey from a medicine of philosophy to a medicine of observation, from a world of balance to a world of battles, from the gentle garden of the herbalist to the gleaming laboratory of the chemist. The alchemical dream of Paracelsus, to find the pure essence of healing, had set medicine on a new and revolutionary path. We emerge from our journey, blinking as if stepping out from a darkened, candle-lit chamber into the bright, stark light of the modern day. We have traveled through a world that is at once deeply alien and strangely familiar. We have stood beside the physician as he contemplated the universe in a flask of urine, felt the sharp bite of the surgeon's lancet, and breathed in the complex aromas of the apothecary's shop. We have seen a medical system not of ignorance, but of a different kind of knowledge, a complete and coherent world built on the elegant logic of the four humors. It was a world where the body was a microcosm of the cosmos, where the health of humanity was tied to the movements of the stars and the qualities of the seasons, and where every illness was a story of internal disharmony. To us, their methods can seem brutal, their theories fanciful. We see the pain of bloodletting, the folly of judging a disease by the taste of urine, the terror of a conscious amputation. We see a system that was powerless against the true nature of infection and the microscopic agents of plague. And yet, through our modern lens, we must also see the shared humanity. We must recognize the profound desire to heal, to comfort, and to make sense of the terrifying randomness of suffering. The medieval healer, in their own way, was striving for the same thing as the modern doctor, to restore the patient to wholeness. They offered not just a purge or a potion, but an explanation. They gave the patient a narrative for their pain, a place in an ordered universe, which is itself a powerful form of healing. We see in their work the early seeds of our own practices. In the monastery infirmary, we see the birth of the hospital. In the quarantine orders of the plague years, we see the dawn of public health. In the chemical experiments of the alchemists, we see the beginnings of pharmacology. And in the gentle, holistic care of the herbalist and the midwife, we are reminded that medicine is, and has always been, both a science and an art, a practice that must treat not just a disease, but a person. The lights in our own world may be brighter, but the shadows of fear, illness, and mortality that we inhabit are the very same.